Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Time with Junebug. That's me. And if you see me looking over to the side a lot, Dinky Sue, or the fuzzy orange Cheeto cat, she might be getting a hairball. A couple times she has had a hairball. We've just found it. She did it while we were gone. But since I've gotten home from work like an hour ago, she keeps going pet, pet. So I feel like that's a sign she just might have a hairball soon. So she's also being kind of needy. But you know, that's nothing new with Dinky Sue. But hello. If you see me being concerned, it's because my cat might throw up any second now. You're being very needy. Do you not feel good? Oh, there she is. So, yeah. If I just randomly leave her, there's a cut, she might have just thrown up. So, sorry. As you've noticed lately, I've fallen down a slight rabbit hole of wrongly convicted people, or like people who were in prison who should not have been. Well, today is no different. I do want to note, no animals again are involved. There's no, playing with the curtain. There's no dingoes, there's no coyotes, there's nothing, okay? Just people. We're doing another wrongfully incarcerated case. So today we're talking about Betty Tyson and a little bit John Duvall. I had not heard of either of these cases. They're technically like one and the same, but still. The Wikipedia page, this big. So there's not much. I obviously do research in other places, but just when a Wikipedia page is this big, you know, there wasn't a ton. Anyway, talking about Betty Tyson and John Duvall. No relation to Mike Tyson, I'm 99% sure. This takes place May of 1973, so we're going back a bit. And the ages, because I always say the ages of the victims in case anything with children bothers you, but they were 24 and 21. I've seen different sources say different things, but they're around these ages. And this takes place in New York, specifically Rochester. And this is a solved case for Betty and John, at least. But anyway, like I said at the beginning, there's not a ton of info about this case, at least that I could find. A lot of repeated stuff in the articles I saw. But we're going to start with Betty Tyson because there is a lot more info about her than John. Betty Tyson was actually born, I believe, Betty Dove. She was born June 29th of 1948 to her mother, Maddie Lawson Buchanan. And I didn't see a ton on her upbringing. I know, like, bare minimum. Like, saw she grew up fatherless. He just kind of skedaddled. I don't know if it was soon after she was born. She also grew up in a family with 8 kids. So she had many siblings, big family. She also dropped out of school at 14, unfortunately, and turned to prostitution to feed a heroin habit at 14. So, a bit rough. So not great. But she also around when she was 17, I only saw this mentioned in like 1 or 2 sources, but she married Arthur Tyson. That's where the last name Tyson comes from for her. But they divorced like 6 months later. Wasn't a great marriage, just her upbringing, just not great. Her life up until this point. And she would eventually meet John Duvall at some point during her prostitution days. And I could not find any early life info for John. I just know he was born obviously a few years after Betty because he's slightly younger. He would also turn to prostitution and eventually, you know, meet Betty. I do want to know also for John that I saw sources say John was either transgender, but I didn't know if it meant like used to be like lady and then into man, or if it was man transitioning to a woman. But then I also saw sources that said John just was like a drag queen, like he would dress up as a woman for like his clients. Not 100% sure. Just I guess wanted to throw that out there because it was mentioned a couple times. I also want to know, I don't know if like Betty and John were close at all. I don't necessarily think they were, but they're just kind of thrown into this together, unfortunately. Now we're going to jump ahead from their childhoods to May 25th of 1973. So when a guy just walking his dog, minding his business in an alley in Rochester, New York, which seems weird to walk dogs in alleys, but I'm not a city folk, maybe that's normal. But this poor dude just walking his dog found a body, and it was the body of Timothy Hayworth, who was in his early 50s. Now, Hayworth was a white Philadelphian who was a businessman. I don't want to say not the usual type you see killed in an alley, because anyone can unfortunately be killed in an alley, but just give a descriptor for them. Because obviously, if you can't see the pictures, Betty and John were black. So knowing that, and then the person who was found is white, you kind of already understand the setup. But Timothy was found to be choked by his own necktie and was hit to death by a brick. So that's not good. They also said his mouth was stuffed with weeds. I don't know if I meant literal weed or just like dandelions or something, but his mouth was stuffed with weeds. Now, it's believed Hayworth left his hotel room the night before to go looking for a prostitute. Obviously, I don't know if he found one or not. If he didn't ever find one, don't know. Also want to note, one of the main things at the crime scene, minus Timothy, was there were fresh tire tracks in the alley. Now, the tire tracks and the fact that they were looking, like Timothy was looking for a prostitute that night, that led them to arrest Betty and John days later. Why Betty and John? Well, prostitutes. But it said Betty was the only prostitute in town with a car. How they know that, I don't quite know. Like, I don't think there's a registry for prostitutes with cars somewhere, but they seem to know this. So they're like, well, tire tracks, he was looking for a prostitute, it must be Betty. And I guess John, for some reason. But they arrest them both because of these things. But I guess it would make slightly more sense why they took John as well, because there were two teens who were witnesses that said they saw Betty and John with Hayworth the night of his murder. So that's not looking too good. Again, I'm not 100% sure why they thought John was involved. I saw some sources that said the teens saw Betty and John, but then some sources just said Betty. Again, I'm not 100% sure why John's there, but he is. So, just to let you know. Some believed that they killed him together, maybe. I did have a slight theory that because knowing what we know now, that we're going down a wrongly accused rabbit hole right now. Stonewall happened in 1969. This is 1973. And John was gay, or he was part of the queer community based off of the articles I've seen. So I could just see them just being discriminatory towards him. Now, they went to trial because they're just like, yep, these two did it, let's go. Now, despite there being literally no physical evidence that linked either of them to the crime, and turns out the tire tracks found near the scene did not match the treads on Betty's car at all. Wasn't her car. So they were both, even with the no evidence, they were both found guilty of the murder of Hayworth. Now, I do want to note before someone does comment it, they did both confess to this crime, quotes, but Betty she actually recanted her statement, and she's never confessed, quote unquote, to it again, because it turns out she was actually beaten by the police for 12 hours to give a confession, and she was also still on drugs at the time. She had a heroin addiction, so she was just strung out on drugs, getting beat, and she confessed to this crime that she later changes and says she did not do. Then at another point in time, because John also confessed to the murder, he didn't necessarily recant right away, which we'll get to later, but he mentioned he was also beaten for a confession. Now, I don't know much about the trial itself, because it seemed to go by pretty fast. They seem to have already made up their minds. But it was an all-white male jury that found them guilty. No shocker there. And they sentenced them to 25 years to life in prison. So basically, life in prison. Now, I do want to know, again, I'm doing a short version of this case. I'm sure there's a lot more stuff out there, especially when it comes to the actual trial. But I'm just doing the basics. Now, they both went to prison after this trial for killing Timothy Hayworth. Quotations around that, because remember, no evidence. And nothing happened. Remember, they went to prison in 73. Nothing happened until 1997. So 24 years into their sentence. Nothing happened for 24 years. Everyone was like, you know what? Seems legit. When one of the two witnesses that said they'd seen Betty and John with Timothy Hayworth that night came forward and stated they were forced to give that confession. They were forced by police, obviously. They were forced to give that confession by the police, even though they said they actually did not see John or Betty that night with Timothy. I don't even know if they actually saw Timothy, but I know they didn't actually see Betty or John with Timothy. I also want to point out that it was noted that the main detective for the case had resigned in 1980 after fabricating evidence for another case. Now, due to this evidence coming out, the fact that the witnesses did not see them, and the head detective has been caught fabricating evidence in other cases, Betty was given a new lawyer, whose name was John Getz. And he would gather more evidence to try to prove her innocence and get her out of prison. They went back to court in 1998. However, things kind of came to a halt, but thankfully, because the DA office decided the conviction should just be tossed out. Conviction was tossed out, the indictment dismissed, and she did not need to be retried at all, actually. She was just free to go, and they released her. Now, why did they just have a full 180? Well, we do know the evidence like this. One witness came forward saying they were coerced, but you could make the argument that, well, maybe they're being coerced now. But when the lawyers were doing digging for their retrial of Betty, they found an old document that the police forgot, quote unquote, to give over to the courts or to the lawyers, that said the second witness, as well as the first, actually stated when they were being interrogated that they had actually not seen Betty or John that night. There was actual evidence that they wrote down, the police officers, years ago when this first happened, that they didn't see them with Timothy. And they just forgot to mention that. So once they saw that report, they were like, well, never mind, just let her out. No. Thankfully, because of this, Betty was released from prison May 28th of 1998, which is 25 years later. She was in prison for 25 years for something she did not do. Very much did not do. Now, John was a bit different of a scenario. He would not be overturned, not have his conviction overturned until 1990, and acquitted until 2000. I saw it took John a bit longer for his process, although he wasn't that far behind Betty, due to him confessing, quote unquote, a second time to the crime. I saw that he confessed the second time, according to this article, because he thought he would get a retrial easier this way. I'm not sure the logic, but he thought it would help for some reason, telling the police what they wanted to hear, which, I mean, I could sort of understand that logic, but he confessed a second time. Again, there's no evidence. He just yeah, sure, I did it. But again, no evidence, and he was released in 2000. 99 or 2000. I saw different sources. Now let's get into the aftermath. So we'll start with John again, because unfortunately there is not much info about him as there is about Betty. But John would try try to file a lawsuit but under the New York compensation statute, but he unfortunately was dismissed. Don't know why he was dismissed, but he was. But then unfortunately, shortly after he was released from prison, he would pass away in 2006. So he got 6 years of freedom before he passed away, and he was between 50 and 52 at the time. So that's unfortunately how it ended for John. I know there's not much info. I originally wasn't going to cover John because I didn't realize John was involved until I started doing more research on Betty. So I felt like obviously he should be included. But now we're going back to Betty because there's obviously more info on her. She was 49, 50 when she got out of prison, and she would actually, unlike John, get $1.2 million from the city of Rochester for the situation. But unfortunately, I saw articles that the money didn't really last. She would lend it out to careless family members and friends, and she would just end up struggling financially a lot for the rest of her life. And she also had a hard time getting jobs in fields she was trained in. I can just imagine it being hard to get a job anyway after being in prison for 25 years, but just want to note that. And the reason I say she was trained in, because she dropped out of school and was fairly young when she went to prison, but turns out in prison, she was actually the longest serving female inmate in New York at the time, which she didn't even do anything, and she was the longest serving female inmate. That's crazy. But it turns out in prison, she really turned her life around. She said she found religion, she got her GED, she cared for inmates with AIDS, people said. She actually started an exercise program at the prison, which earned her the nickname, quote, the Jane Fonda of Bedford Hills, end quote. That's a long nickname, but it works. It saw she became a chef, and she took photography classes where she ended up actually winning competitions with her photography, and she would actually qualify as a printing apprentice due to this. So when I said she couldn't find work in fields that she was trained in, like she couldn't find anything like dealing with printing or photography or a chef, unfortunately. She was also known to help out the newer inmates. I saw an article where they said they sometimes just called her mom, and everyone just really seemed to like Betty. She seems pretty awesome based off of this. And Betty, I saw, also believes she probably would have died on the streets if she hadn't gone to prison, whether it be from like an overdose, being killed, or AIDS, she hypothesized. She's not saying she's necessarily grateful for being in prison 25 years of her life, but she thinks it did save her life. And then I also saw, unfortunately, her mother did get to see her get out of prison, but her mother would actually pass 6 months after she was released. So that was quite sad. And then there wasn't like a ton of info. It was just kind of like broad about her life after prison. I saw at some points in her life, she lost a home to foreclosure, and she was only making, at some point, $143 a week cleaning a daycare center. I also saw she was arrested in 2011 for stealing scissors and a knife from a grocery store. The charges were dismissed, though, I saw. So life for Betty was never easy, it seemed like, but she seemed to take it in stride. I think it's fair to say. But unfortunately, as of last year actually, Betty passed away August 17th of 2023 from a heart attack. She was 75. So she had just reached the milestone of 25 years out of prison. So she was out of prison as long as she was in. And that is the sad case of wrongfully convicted Betty Tyson and John Duvall. Sorry if I seemed a bit out of it. I am distracted by the cat who is on the verge of throwing up. Anyway, hope you enjoyed today's case. And I feel horrible for Betty and John. They should not have been in prison that long. They shouldn't have been in prison at all. Don't know what I'm doing next, but I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.